Welcome to this second in our Faith in a Changing World seminar series hosted by Catherine of Siena College. This Zoom recording was made on Friday the 26th of March, and it's a conversation between Tina Beattie and Sarah Sims on the theme Becoming Beyond Death, a dialogue about feminism, finitude and vulnerability. Feminist thinkers are often critical of a philosophical and theological preoccupation with death, which they associate with the masculine imaginary. Thinkers such as Luce Irigaray and Grace Jansen seek to shift the focus away from death and resurrection to birth and incarnation. Others, such as Judith Butler and Adriana Cavarero, weave vulnerability and finitude into their reflections on embodiment and gender. But is there still hope beyond death for thinkers who are precariously balanced between the promises and proclamation of the Christian faith and the persuasive insights of feminist theory? This conversation between Sarah Sims and Tina Beattie was chaired by Anupama Ranawana. Sarah is a PhD student in philosophy at DePaul University in Chicago. Her research attempts to bring feminist philosophy and religious thought into conversation on relationality, mortality, and the human desire for transcendence. Tina Beattie is Professor Emerita of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton in London and Director of Catherine of Siena College based at Roehampton. Her research interests include sacramentality and gender, Marian theology, art and devotion, and women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. Anupama Ranawana is a feminist theologian and international development theorist with extensive experience of working in academia and in NGOs. She's the tutor for the Catherine of Siena College course on Asian theologies. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for what we intend to be quite an informal dialogue between Sarah Sims, who's doing a PhD in philosophy at DePaul University in Chicago, and myself, and chaired by Anupama Ranawana. Oh, here's my wine supplies just arriving. One can't do an academic seminar without a glass of wine. There will be a few more people, I think, joining us as we go through, but we'll make a punctual start so as we finish on time as well. So I'm just welcoming you on behalf of Catherine of Siena College, which many of you will know is an online college based at the University of Roehampton, offering courses in theology, gender and social justice, with a particular focus on the educational needs of women in the global south, but we're open to all who are interested. I'm the director of the college, and Dr. Anna can tell me, I don't know if Anna's with us tonight or not, but she's the assistant director and we run the college together. But I'm going to hand over to Anupama now, for who's chairing this evening, for an introduction and to kick us off. So over to you, Anu.
Thank you so much, Tina. It's great to be here again, following on from the first conversation, which I think was particularly interesting. And I'm really, really, really honored to be chairing this after Tina chaired the first one. So hopefully I can do justice to the chairing. I think the conversation that we're having tonight is particularly pertinent in these pandemic times. Where we are asking, I think, so many questions about our own vulnerability, not only as individuals, but also as communities, global communities, thinking together. And also as we head into Holy Week, and the questions that brings up for all of us as well. So speaking together today, rather, I should say, are two extremely interesting scholars. The first is Sarah Sims. Sarah is a PhD student in philosophy at DePaul University. Her research attempts to bring feminist philosophy and religious thought into conversation on relationality, mortality, and the human desire for transcendence. Responding to Sarah's talk today is Professor Tina Beattie, who is Professor Emerita of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton and Director of Catherine of Siena College based at Roehampton. Her research interests include sacramentality and gender, Marian theology, art and devotion, and women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. Lacanian psychoanalytic theory that offers a critical lens through which she views her theological sources, which include Thomas Aquinas, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Pope John Paul II's Theology of the Body. Tina also has a novel that was published in 2019 called The Good Priest, and which I understand has some excellent reviews. In the conversation today, we'll be picking up on several rather contemplative themes, looking at how our finitude makes us vulnerable, thinking through the way in which human endeavors and desires are constituted by the possibility of failure, but also reflecting on beauty and why beauty is important, but also fleeting. And I'm so excited to hear what both of these fantastic scholars have to say to us today. So without any further ado, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Anupama. And thank you, Tina. It's so great to be talking with both of you today and everyone who is here as well. And I'm so grateful to Catherine of Siena College for putting together this Faith in the Changing World series. It's really such a nice opportunity in what has been kind of an isolating year in a lot of ways. So it's very nice to be able to talk with all of you. So Tina, I thought I would just give a little bit of background on the conversation that we're having today, because really it's a continuation of a discussion that we've been having over the last couple of months over email and recently over Zoom. And that conversation was sparked because I had the great fortune to pick up your book, Theology After Postmodernity, which if there's anyone on this call who hasn't read it, please do order it right away. It's absolutely wonderful. And it stages a really just challenging, compelling dialogue between the psychoanalytic theorist Jacques Lacan on the one hand and the theologian Thomas Aquinas. And there are a lot of parts of that book that I love and I'm still kind of chewing on. But one of the moments in it that has really stuck with me the most is your very last chapter in that book, which offers what you made clear is not necessarily a theological academic argument about the nature of the afterlife, but instead is a kind of creative, personal, spiritual reflection on the nature of the resurrected body. And one thing that you clarify right away is that, some of us might think about the notion of glorified bodies as some kind of airbrushing away all of our kind of bodily quirks and wrinkles and stretch marks and scars, and give us these kind of supermodel glorified bodies preserved in perfect youth. And you say, that's not what I hope the resurrected body is like at all. And instead, what you say is that you hope that that future body will be a kind of testament to the deeply relational character of your life. And you talk about that in a number of senses, but one of the ways that really stood out to me is talking about your body as a maternal body and saying, I want my body to continue to have signs of the fact that it held another human being within itself and gave nurture and protection and safety to another life. And if you want to understand me as a person, I can't be reduced to motherhood, but you also can't understand me without understanding my experience as a mother. And so those kind of signs on the body are important to understand who you as a singular individual are. But it's also important because it tells us something about God. There's something about the experience of maternity that gives us a kind of insight into the nature of divine love, which throughout your book you talk about as a kind of deeply relational maternal trinity. And so I was just so moved when I read this moment in your text, because it hit upon all kinds of questions that I was asking in my academic life, in my personal life, and also as someone who has spent many years of her adult life volunteering in hospice care. And I guess if I could sum up the kind of core question that I had been grappling with, and I'm still grappling with now, it's something like, what does it mean to hope for life after death, and specifically to hope for Christian resurrection as a woman and as a feminist? And I'll maybe give a little bit of background on myself. So I, for the most part, I'm not trained in theology. My educational background is in philosophy, and I've spent a lot of my time studying pretty kind of adamantly secular philosophers and feminist philosophy. And some of those thinkers, Tina, you and I have as common touchstones. So just to name a few: Judith Butler, Adriana Cavarero, but right now I want to focus on Luce Irigaray. And Irigaray offers us what I think is a very potent critique of a certain kind of desire for transcendence that she first locates in Plato and then kind of traces throughout the Western canon, including in Christian thought. And the tendency that she is trying to kind of draw out in critique is what she sees as a deeply masculine and solipsistic desire to survive death in such a way that requires a total renunciation of embodiment, of nature, of the feminine, of human singularity, of human relationship. And all of these categories are kind of deeply associated for Irigaray, and she thinks in Plato as well. And so, in order to kind of transcend death, we need to renounce the conditions that actually make us human and the conditions that are deeply associated with womanhood. And so as an alternative, Irigaray is going to say, well, look, maybe we should stop fixating on the desire to transcend death. And instead, we need to think about transcendence in a new way. We need to think of transcendence as something that we cultivate within our embodied life in the here and now. It's something that we can find in the natural world. And I think there's a lot of merit to both of those points from Irigaray. First of all, this critique of a kind of unhealthy understanding of transcendence, but also, the desire to seek a connection to the divine in our embodied life. Nonetheless, I feel like I've had a kind of deep worry that Irigaray kind of writes off too soon, that there might be other reasons that we would hope for something like the resurrection that aren't rooted in this kind of solipsistic masculine desire for total autonomy and disembodied existence. But instead, maybe that desire for many of us comes from a deeply relational context, from the profound love that we have for singular individuals, and from a recognition that who we each are is totally informed by our relations to other people. And when we have that kind of love for another person, and we're aware of the way those relationships have played just a pivotal role in shaping us, then death is frightening to us in a different way. It's not frightening because it puts an end to some kind of like unimpeded, disembodied, autonomous existence. It frightens us because it threatens to sever the bonds that have shaped us as human beings. And, and then on the other hand, a kind of hope for the resurrection is rooted not in a desire for disembodiment or something like that, but a desire to have those bonds lovingly preserved and infused with new life. And so, this is kind of an issue that I've been hanging on to for a while. And so then when I read Tina's book, I was like, isn't this kind of the most beautiful picture of exactly that kind of relational hope or desire for resurrection? But that said, I think there might still be a couple of issues that need to be worked through, questions that secular feminists might pose to us about this kind of hope for an afterlife, because I think they might have certain worries that even if it's related, or even if it's rooted in this kind of relational context, the desire itself is still a kind of lingering remnant of this kind of masculine narrative about what matters in life. And so I'll just maybe pose a couple of them as quickly as possible. The first has to do with the horizontal structure of human life. And here again, I have in mind a rigoride, but also a thinker who has really deeply informed her thinking, Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger tells us that to be a human being is to be in a kind of continuous dynamic movement into the future. But that future isn't without limit, right? It has a horizon, and that horizon is our death. And so as we each project ourselves into the future and taking up possibilities, we hit upon the limit of our coming death, and it sends us back to the here and now to take up new possibilities. And so Heidegger will say that fundamentally the human being is a being towards death. And there might be something about that sounds very morbid, but I think for Heidegger, actually, it is the fact that we're finite. It is the fact that we have this horizon that we are always projecting against that opens up the possibility of having possibilities at all. It gives us the possibility to give dynamic shape to ourselves, right? And to engage in a process of self-transformation. And I think if we move to a rigoride, she certainly is not going to want to be as fixated on death as Heidegger. But I think what she will stress is that it's really important that we come to terms with, what she calls in to be born, our finiteness. And she means that in more than one sense. Our finiteness is not just our mortality. Our finiteness is also the specificity of our embodiment, right? That places certain boundaries on our existence that we're always responding to and cultivating ourselves within. But I think for her, it's very important that we do come to terms with these embodied limits that we find ourselves within, because it's only then that we can really flourish, that we can give shape to ourselves. And I think for both of those thinkers, the prospect of a kind of life beyond death, a life that moves beyond that horizontal limit of our finitude, might lead us not to a kind of dynamic process of becoming, but instead to a kind of stagnation and paralysis, and would really kind of end the dynamism of what it is to be human. So that's one worry that I'd kind of like to hear your thoughts on, Tina. And I'll just raise one more quickly, and it has to do with vulnerability. And I think, here I have in mind Judith Butler and Adriana Cavarero, who each have very different projects in a lot of ways, but I think a commitment that they have in common is to the fundamental vulnerability of every human being and how important that is in our understanding of ethics. And I think what they would both be agreed on, and Cavarero talks about vulnerability as the radical exposure to both care and wounding. She says, we find ourselves in relation to others, we find ourselves utterly exposed, but that is what calls us to respond to the vulnerability of the other person. It's what brings us into relationship with each other to begin with. And that means that vulnerability enables human relationship. It's what grounds ethics. And that recognition of interdependence that comes out of vulnerability is also the source of meaning making. It's because we're interdependent that we're called to create the meaning of our lives together. And so I think another worry that would come from Butler and maybe Cavarero as well is that in hoping for a kind of immortality, that we might be hoping for a life beyond our vulnerabilities. And, I think you speak really beautifully, Tina, in the book about how, you hope that those lingering signs of vulnerability would remain on the resurrected body. And you talk about the body of Christ as still having his wounds marked on him, right? They're not washed away for our comfort, but maybe there's something different about the memory of vulnerability and the continuation of it. And so I think there might be a worry that if we don't have the same kind of vulnerability, or if we're hoping for a life where we wouldn't have that vulnerability, that there's something about that commitment that also undermines what brings us into relation with one another. And so maybe we need to do some thinking about, well, what grounds relationality beyond a kind of fundamental physical vulnerability? And so I guess I just want to ask your opinion now about, how do we answer these critiques in such a way that we can talk about this hope, not as a hope for stagnation and paralysis and the severing of relations, but actually a kind of continuation of this becoming that's kind of infused with new life, and maintains the profoundly relational character of human existence. And I don't know, maybe you can solve that in 15 minutes or so. I think you're muted.
Tina, I think you're muted.
Yes, it's all right. I'm unmuted now. I couldn't find myself on the screen, and now I need to hide myself because I can't bear seeing myself talking. So let me get rid of me. There we are. Thank you.
Good. I think that gallery view is often the kindest thing to have on.
Yes, I've got gallery view on now. Thank you really so much for those thought-provoking questions, Sarah. And as Sarah said, this began as a really interesting email exchange a few weeks ago, which got me reading Adriana Cavarera's Inclinations. And lo and behold, I love the way these things happen. This week, I had an email from Claire Woodford, who's a political philosopher at the University of Brighton, saying, I'm really interested in your writing on Mariology, but I'm not a theologian. And I've been reading Adriana Cavarera's book, Inclinations, and it's raising all sorts of questions. And I just thought, this is just amazing. I think Claire's joined us tonight. She said she was going to, but we are going to take up a Zoom discussion as well. So these things happen in really interesting serendipitous ways. I always think serendipity is another word for grace. And I'm just going to bounce off a few ideas that Sarah's really unanswerable questions trigger in me. One of the philosophical dictums that has always seemed to me to expose the ignorance at the heart of the masculine philosophical project is, I think it's Jeremy Bentham who described suicide as a victimless crime. And that to me is the ultimate in philosophical wrong thinking about what death means, because every death, no woman is an island, no man is an island, no person is an island. Every death diminishes me and leaves me in mourning. And particularly this last year with the COVID pandemic, not only has it brought death very much into the very center of our smug consumerist lives in a way that we can't avoid it. And when I say we, I'm talking here as a Western citizen, consumer, academic, and I'm really delighted to see that we've got lots of people here tonight who are not in that position. I know many of you are actually in the global south or in communities that are extremely poor and struggling with this and are doing daily hands-on volunteer work. I recognize from some of the names. So, this is very much a certain sort of Western take on this, and you might want to come in during the discussion and take it somewhere else. But one of the most harrowing things about the last year has been people dying alone, the unbearable grief of people whose parents have died in care homes. In the UK, we had the story of a very young boy who died alone of COVID in the early days. So there is something about being abandoned at the moment of death, which is unthinkable in ethical terms to most of us. It's more unthinkable than the knowledge that our loved ones will die, is the idea that they might die alone, that we might not be there. And I know Sarah Everard, who was abducted and killed in London a couple of weeks ago, her her parents, someone sort of saying to them, you're going to ask yourself over and over again, why couldn't I be there for her? So immediately death plunges us into relationality and loss. I'm going to share my PowerPoint because I did just grab a few quotes and things before we started, just as an aid memoir for me, but also just to trigger some ideas. And one of the questions we're asking tonight is about the sort of male philosophical imaginary. And by another serendipitous move, last night a friend recommended Nabokov's Speak Memory, and I started to read it last night. And this is how that book opens. This is the first paragraph. The cradle rocks above an abyss, and common sense tells us that our existence is but a brief crack of light between two eternities of darkness. Although the two are identical twins, man as a rule views the prenatal abyss with more calm than the one he is heading for at some 4,500 heartbeats an hour. So reflecting on this dialogue, I read that and thought, oh my goodness. And that took me back to some research I've been doing on birth, and a quotation from Mary O'Brien writing on the dialectics of reproduction. Death has haunted the male philosophical imagination since man the thinker first glimmered into action, and in our own time has become the stark reality which preoccupies existentialism, an untidy and passionately pessimistic body of thought in which lonely and heroic man attempts to defy the absurdity of the void which houses his consciousness and his world. The inevitability and necessity of these biological events has quite clearly not exempted them from historical force and theoretical significance. We have no comparable philosophies of birth. Now, where I criticize feminist theorists and theologians of natality is that they seem to me sometimes to be buying back into the same old dualism. So Grace Jansen, who from Hannah Arendt would oppose natality to sacrifice, borrowing heavily, of course, from Luce Irigaray, who does the same. And I think this is to miss the fact that when we give birth to death. It's the only certainty after being born that life offers us. You will die. And so every act of childbirth is also a dying. It's a dying not just for the inevitability of the child's death, but for the mother knowing that if she's very fortunate in life, she will die before this child and not have to bear the horror of the child's death. But she has no guarantees. We are born into vulnerability and we give birth into vulnerability. And with that in mind, I pulled up this Leonardo painting of St. Anne with the Virgin and Child, which Cavarero sees very much as illustrating her point in her book Inclinations, that relational maternal life is a leaning towards and inclining towards the intimate other in such a way that she contrasts it, for example, with the metaphor of uprightness, rectitude, symbolized by Plato's philosopher going up to the light out of the cave, but also symbolized by the tree, which many philosophers like to draw on imageries of trees as that which stands planted and rooted. And, I was thinking of the discovery in recent years, beautifully explored in Robert Macfarlane's book, Underlands, I think it's called, that trees actually are the most communicative of plants. They communicate, it seems, through fungi, through mushrooms growing under the soil. And they look out for each other, they protect each other, they give warnings to each other. So the tree is by no means this solitary, upright symbol of independence. On the contrary, it's totally interconnected with other life. And now I'm very grateful to Claire Woodford, and this is another wonderful bit of serendipity. Thanks to Sarah, I began reading Inclinations, and this week I had an email from Claire Woodford saying, I've been writing and researching on Cavarero and maternal life, and could we have a conversation about Mariology around this? And I read Claire's essay on how Cavarero interprets this image of the Virgin and Child. And what I'm saying now is quite indebted to that essay. But I was troubled by Cavarero seeing this really in terms of the mother leaning protectively towards the child. And St. Anne is this restraining presence that allows her to lean, but almost prevents her from toppling. And St. Anne doesn't hold her back so that Christ can fulfill his sacrificial destiny. She lets her lean. But Cavarero, although she's very aware of violence and vulnerability and wounding, to me, she still glosses motherhood in this image, because the child is holding on to his own death, and he's trying to get away from his mother to become being towards death, if I want to put it that way. The sacrificial lamb is who he is destined to be. And she's doing what mothers dangerously do. She's trying to protect him. She's trying to hold him back. And it's her mother, St. Anne, who has this ironic presence. St. Anne has her hand on her hip. She's not holding Mary, as far as I can see. It's an unfinished painting. Maybe there was more to come. But look at how her feet are kind of pointed away from the maternal drama. St. Anne is not just the grandmother and the mother. She's the woman who knows that she must grow up and let go in something that Mary, the Virgin, hasn't learned yet. You must grow up and let go so that your children can make their own way in their lives. But it seems to me what the philosophical imagination and the Western philosophical imaginary has done is to make that way, as Irigaray would say, as a kind of phallic trajectory going up towards destiny and light, and never looking back at the mother who mourns and grieves and never surrenders the relationship, come what may. And I know that relationship doesn't have to be idealized and perfected. I know that women who have abortions often feel it was the right thing. I don't regret it, but I grieve. And that seems to me where a certain kind of, well, if I speak as a Catholic theologian, an ethic won't allow both a lack of regret, but a process of lifelong mourning and loss and grief for what one's decisions sometimes cost. And that makes me think of Alice Meynell's poem, Maternity. One wept whose only child was dead, newborn 10 years ago. Weep not, he is in bliss, they said. She answered, even so, 10 years ago was born in pain a child not now forlorn, but 10 years ago in vain a mother was born. And this to me speaks of that vulnerability, that when the mother knows the child exists, whatever her decisions about that pregnancy, that child's future, whatever happens, that child will never not exist for her. And there will never be anything in her again that wasn't a mother birthed into death, whatever happens. So I want to avoid the dualism of natality as the opposite to sacrifice, and say we've got to be able to hold these. And so what do we do with some of the questions Sarah raises? Well, what really occurs to me is, first of all, I don't want to talk in terms of evidence, but it seems to me that nature, particularly at this time of year, bears witness to resurrection. Everything that's dead is coming to life. And of course, as someone who was born and grew up in Zambia, it only now makes sense to me, living in Britain, why Easter should come at this time of year. In Zambia, it really didn't have that creation-centered resonance. But I was watching a wildlife documentary, one of David Attenborough's, the other night, and there was this image of a frog that lives in a very cold climate during winter. And for 4 months of the year, this frog absolutely freezes, rock solid, dead to all appearances. And when nature begins to thaw, this frog thaws, and the sort of camera showed us how in the course of a day it went from being a block of ice to being a living creature again. I've also been reading this week how sea slugs can detach their heads and grow a new body. Starfish can grow a new star on the end of one of their severed legs, and on and on and on we go. There is so much in nature that we don't understand and that seems to us miraculous. And that brings me to think of quantum physics. Now, I'm not going to go there in any depth, but scientists themselves don't understand what it is that allows a knowable material universe to emerge from what seem to be particles of energy, streams of energy attracted to one another in complex, sometimes seemingly random ways. And that leads me to think, why should the resurrection be a supernatural flash bang on the other side of the tomb? I'm really happy to think it's just an aspect of nature that we don't yet understand about our species, that we pass through this quantum barrier into the material being that really, really exists at the subatomic level. And then we become all that we don't know as part of that thrumming world of desire held in being by God. And then that brings me to philosophers seeing death as the barrier, and we have to go through that barrier. And here I come to vulnerability. I mean, I did play with these ideas in the last chapter of that book that Sarah's mentioned, but I tend not to play very much with these ideas because I am actually, I think, okay most of the time to rest in unknowing, and unknowing is vulnerability. When my mother died, we had a pretty awful relationship, and that wasn't a sort of, oh, it can be awful now because in death we'll be reconciled. It was just at times, oh my God, she's taking so long to die and she's getting so difficult. People go there. That's what we do. We don't wish others dead, but sometimes we struggle to love them alive. And I just remember thinking, when my mother dies, the guilt is going to come in tsunamis. When my mother died, I just had such deep peace that wherever she was, we were forgiven and forgiving, that she would see I loved her much more than I was able to express. And I knew that she loved me much more than she was able to express. And that, to me, is the relationality of death and what comes after. It's not, I don't have so many questions, but it's the ultimate vulnerability. That is where inclinations, we lean in, we lean towards, and there's nothing. What are we leaning towards? Only our own extinction. And it seems to me that if we can develop an ethos of relationality, of vulnerability that knows that our own death is often much, much less a horrifying prospect than the death of those we love. As we've seen with people dying alone and their loved ones unable to get over the trauma of those solitary deaths where they couldn't be there. All this needs to come into our reflections on death. But then I think if you belong to that upright rectitude of the male philosophical imaginary as it's developed since the Enlightenment, that's too much to ask. That vulnerability, chuck yourself into the void, and only then will you feel the arms reaching out to catch you. It's better to say, there is nothing. I chuck myself against the horizon of death, and in a Heideggerian fashion, that bounces me back into the life where I have control. I know my destiny. My destiny ends when my control ends, and I am not willing to throw myself into the aftermath. And that finds extension. Now, I'm not proclaiming any absolutes here, it's a grey area, but I do think it finds some extension in some campaigns for voluntary euthanasia. I will not become dependent. I will not become a newborn at the end of my life, shitting and peeing myself, and as vulnerable to the care of others as I was the day I was born. I will not let that happen to me. I will decide when I die. I will have control. I will decide my life. Now, COVID has shown us we are vulnerable. We are interdependent. No man is an island, despite bloody Brexit. We are joined together underground by those fungal growths, overground by our love. And that's where we have to position our thoughts about death. So,
Goodness. Wow. Thank you very much, both Tina and Sarah. What an incredible conversation that ran the gamut from the mournable body to quantum physics, which I think, is increasingly only happening in certain spaces, especially when we live in a world where Dorothy Day is being honored with the ferry boat, I think. I parked that observation. I want to give time for everyone to speak and ask questions. I won't respond for too long, but I think there were so many moving parts in what has been said in this conversation today, and I think one of the key questions is not only asking what is a glorified body, but what is the body that is valorized. And I was thinking about the work of Rosi Figueroa when she's talking about Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse, and the discussion of the body of trauma there. And I thought that would be something also to continue to reflect on this question, and asking what does it mean to hope for life after death pinpoints immediately to our vulnerability, our simultaneous leaning toward and away from death, which I think is something both of you raise. So many other thoughts, but something else I was struck by is it's interesting you talk about trees, Tina. I'm reading Peter Wohlleben's book, The Secret Life of Trees, which is a beautiful little book, and he describes in detail how a dead tree has more life in it than a live tree because of all the bacteria and insects and ivy and other leaves and little animals that begin to live in the tree and grow out of it. And I thought that's another way, I mean, similar to what you're talking about, this kind of the thrumming to which perhaps we will belong, but we don't know yet that we belong. So I thought that was something there as well. And next to that, also on the question of maternity and death and abortion, I think also that mothers, in a way, have that awareness of bringing life that will result in death, but also in the process of that, dying to self. There's also that process that has gone through. I say this not as someone who has actually had a child myself, but just in my own understandings of friends who have had children. That willingness to die to self, to know, and then also the knowingness that the life you bring will have death, an inescapable death. And I think also women who have had abortions and the grief that they go through. And I wonder often is what is that grief? The grief may be that the choice of losing a child, but also perhaps the grief of their own life, their own kind of encounter with life. So those are just some of my thoughts listening to the two of you have this extremely provocative conversation. But I'll stop talking now, and perhaps if Sarah, you want to respond very quickly, or we can also open to the floor if you would like. If you prefer not to speak directly, please put your question in the chat and I can read it out for you as well. Thank you.
I'll just say, Tina, I'll let people ask their questions. That was so helpful. And Anupama as well. I think those are great suggestions of places to turn to. Thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you for bringing us here. And I see that Claire is there just on my screen, just beneath Sarah. Claire, welcome. It's really great to have you with us. And if you want to comment on any of that, please feel free, but don't feel pushed.
Thank you ever so much. That was really fascinating to hear both of your conversations. And like you said, Tina, a really bizarre kind of timing this week that I'd contacted you. And I'm really enjoying the session because I don't often get to sit and talk about these ideas with people. So I'd like to thank both of you for inviting me. Just a couple of reflections, really, rather than direct questions. So it would be lovely to hear your thoughts, but not to demand a response necessarily. It might be more interesting to hear then what other people have to say. But I really liked the reflection on trees, partly because in Adriana Cavarero's reading of Kant, she quotes Kant, I can't remember the exact quote, but Kant thinks about trees growing together as in competition. You know, and they're growing taller, aren't they, in order to kind of get to the light. And it was really nice hearing you think about trees growing in a way that's relational, just kind of countering that Kantian version. So that was really lovely. Also thinking about death and birth, I really kind of enjoyed the way both of you were engaging with these things and kind of trying to counter the narratives that we find, but also trying to think about the way in which feminism might also want to question the kind of theological readings that we might be doing of death and of birth. And I wonder when I read Adriana Cavarero's work, because she criticizes, I think particularly in the chapter on Levinas it comes up, she criticizes the kind of eventual or the kind of event of death that we get. And I'm concerned, and I think I've spoken to Adriana about this a bit, and I think maybe she has a different reading of it, but I'm concerned that what comes across sometimes is that we end up looking then at birth as an event rather than death as an event, and instead trying to move away from that eventual kind of reading of any of these situations and starting to see things more as part of a life cycle through which, and we're all, different people are born and are dying at different times. And often there's a fantastic kind of discussion of fear of death in philosophy seminars. I don't know if other people here have encountered that when you talk about fear of death to other philosophers. And quite often, and maybe I'm a bit cheeky to say this, but a lot of the philosophers I know are male, and they seem to have, they sort of go, oh yes, we shouldn't be so scared of death, but then I am. Isn't everyone scared of death? And sometimes not in a terrible way. I think that death could be very relaxing. I like this idea of a relational death, vulnerability in death. I don't think of death as something where we're cutting off from others. In fact, many folk ideas of death are that you go to join others and you join your families and your friends, and actually then you can get away from the trials and tribulations of the world and enjoy yourself. So I just am really inspired by the ways that both of you are questioning and challenging the dominant traditions. And I don't know if any of the things I've said are of any interest or any use, but I really thank you for the opportunity on a Friday night at the end of my term to actually be able to think about these ideas with you, and to be so inspired by you. So thank you ever so much.
Well, thank you, Claire. I mean, it's just such a delight to me to be sitting here with two people I hadn't heard of 6 weeks ago, and tonight to find that we formed this little kind of when shall we three meet again. So just to thank you for that, because it is really helpful. Your point about the tree being in competition, that seems to me just almost cliched, but so important. What model of life do we have? The competitive or the collaborative? So yeah, I just want to thank you for contributing, really, because it's all helpful in very new ideas. I hadn't read Cavarero at all before Sarah put me on to her, and I'm still reading through Inclinations, but it was just amazing to get your essay this week. I just thought, my goodness. So yeah, thank you.
Serious. Thank you very much. Oops.
Thank you, that's excellent. Sarah, did you want to respond at all to any of that? Or?
Yeah, well, I would just love, Claire, if you could say a little bit more about what's at stake for you in this distinction between understanding birth as event rather than as a kind of maybe continuous cycle or process, and maybe also how much you think that commitment in Cavareiro comes from her reading of Hannah Arendt as kind of the event of birth over and over and over as a radical event each time.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. And my thinking's probably not gone much further, but let me see if I can piece something together for you and what you can do with it. I'd love to hear what you have to say on it. So I suppose it's trying to break that kind of heroic, maybe masculinist narrative, you know, of the great moment, whether that's the great birth or the great death, and trying to think about the fact that actually, particularly I think in the tradition of women's lives and women talking to other women and living together and sharing stories between mothers and daughters, that birth actually, yeah, it is an event, but when you've had kind of more than one child, you know, the different births, they may be remembered, but they're, you know, when you build together one woman's births, if she's got a few children, plus her mother's births, and plus the births of the next generation, actually birth is a very normal event, but one that in today's world strangely causes great problems. So any of us who work and have, you know, gone through pregnancies, whether they've continued the pregnancy or not, or whether, you know, they've had miscarriages or not, and again when people then continue the pregnancy and have a baby, these things are massively disruptive. Then they don't fit into the world, and it's a problem, or it's something that is, you know, just seemed to be this defining event rather than kind of normal. So I think there's a sense of, you know, why is it that we have to read this as the defining event? Then it's really interesting to come to what you said about Arendt, because I think for Arendt, what I find really interesting in Arendt is the theological and then the using that in a more secular sense in her work, because she's thinking about birth, but she's thinking very much about the birth of Jesus and the kind of impact that has and the new and possibility in the world. And I find that perhaps more interesting, particularly, I don't want to go on too long, just please stop me if I'm talking too much. But in Adriana Cavarero's work, I think it is in Inclinations, she makes a really odd, and she doesn't mean it nastily at all, but an odd comment about Arendt, where she says she's childless. And she kind of implies that Arendt sort of didn't like kids. And it might be, I actually need to ask Adriana about this, it might be that there is stuff that all of you guys know, maybe Arendt didn't like children, I just don't know that. But from my research so far, I haven't found any evidence of that. And I find something interesting in the fact that Arendt still thinks of a particular birth, not birth in general, but a particular birth as a value of telling us something about possibility. And that's not necessarily saying people have to go through birth or birth has to happen itself, but that the new can come of, you know, all sorts of things. The new can appear in the world, a horrible world sometimes, and that can change things. And so I think sometimes we generalize birth, and sometimes particularly in philosophy, we then lose the specificity of things like what Arendt is saying, which is that moment of the Christian story was that the whole world potentially changed. The logic or the order of man or masculinity or patriarchy was challenged by that birth. And so that's my kind of my understanding of Arendt, and also the link then with Cavarero and how she's reading birth, and how I think maybe we can think about birth differently, not to move away from the fact that birth is a massive event for a lot of people, and not to say it shouldn't be, but just to say, do we have to make it an event in that capital E sense in philosophy?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I really appreciate that insight. And I think, well, I'd be curious to hear what you think, but it seems to me that there is a kind of potential that comes up in Cavarero's work that maybe doesn't come up in Arendt's, because of the way Arendt understands both our first birth and then our second birth that takes place through action. She wants to kind of understand this, and this is why she's drawing on these Christian theological sources, right, is to understand a kind of creation ex nihilo, right, a coming into being from nothing. And I think what's really kind of lovely and interesting about Cavarero's work is that she wants to take from Arendt this kind of explosion of a kind of new singular individual who appears in the world and kind of radically disrupts, or at least holds the potential to radically disrupt the order that person is coming into. And yet, no person comes from nothing, right? Each person comes from a mother, comes from a context. And the recognition of that opens up the possibility to see continuity kind of together with that radical opening or something like that. But I don't know if that speaks to you. I think you probably know Cavarero much better than I do.
That's a wonderful reflection, Sarah. Thank you. And I think it leads
You
into
might
a
add,
question.
Sorry, I'm aware we've got some questions. I just want to leap in very, very quickly, though, because I should have picked up on what I wanted to say about the event. I also think without any biological determinism and far less masculine, feminine essentialism, bodies teach us things. And I think this thing about the event, I remember once improbably being on a panel with John Milbank and Slavoj Žižek, and the question of the event comes up. And, it's like climactic. For a man, the event in becoming a father is wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. And after that, he can choose how much or how little of that he buys into. Whereas for a woman, there is no event. Conception is a process. The decision to nurture the child is a process. Breastfeeding is a process. Of course, birth, is the moment of separation into something new. But, I think also that language of event is very rooted in male bodily experience. And to me, if we could just talk more about that, so you came, so she got pregnant. She probably didn't come, but she did get pregnant. Let's start there. Anyway, I'm aware people want to talk, so.
Thank you, Tina. Sorry, I should have held space for you before.
No.
I think that what we've been talking about just is well encapsulated in a question we have in the chat from Ellis, who asks, thinking of the tree and the life it produces after it dies, what do people think about cremation? Is it thought that this impacts on afterlife? Or are we thinking in terms of a post-body existence? So I'll leave it to any of the three of you who'd like to respond.
I guess I just want to say, if that frog can defrost and live again, I can probably burn and live again. But I don't know what the hell I mean by saying that. I really don't. I think the quantum self can probably reconstitute itself, whatever, but I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, because I don't go there. I think Carol Bynum, Sarah, you said you were reading her, The Resurrected Body. She's very interesting on these questions.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. I don't think I'm qualified to solve the problem. Still just picking up Bynum's work.
But she's the one to read if you want to know how medieval theologians really did fret a great deal about bodies that had been burned or mutilated or in some other way dismembered.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And sort of how these questions emerge about identity, right? And where is the continuity between the body that dies and the body that will be resurrected? And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's Eilish here.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking, I think it was when I was listening to you about the tree and the body, I was thinking, well, maybe I've got it wrong. I suppose in my head, I don't think about this body coming with me, but I don't really listening to you, I realize I really don't know anything at all as to what to expect in an afterlife or how we think about it. So, and then I was intrigued when we gave the example of the tree producing more life. I thought, well, I wonder if people are thinking that we ought to have a body that produces life afterwards. So, thank you.
Thank you. And it's gone. I was going to make a point, but anyway, I'm sure others have got questions to ask, but thank you for that. It's a really interesting question, and I love the way medieval thinkers kind of worried about it.
I'm not worried about it.
Thank you. Oh, a question from Anna can tell me.
I don't think it is Anna. Is it Anna?
Is it Anna? Oh.
We seem to have lots of Annas, and I think it's got something to do with the Catherine of Siena login to Zoom.
Oh.
Anyway.
A question from the audience. Pregnancy involves a bit of dying. You feel so sick and have other side effects, and you can feel you are losing yourself. The joy of new life you've brought into the world, followed by another dying to self that motherhood can involve. We also have Alison Clark, who has commented, I was naively shocked when my mother died to realize the obvious fact that the cremated remains are inert. Two very, I think, poignant observations. I'd like to respond.
That dying of pregnancy, though, you know, I really do think that in life we're in death. I really do think the process of pregnancy, and I do want to say, whatever one decides, whether to continue it or not, immediately there has to be a confrontation with death. And, you know, a lot of my research is on reproductive health and rights in the global south. Every year, nearly 300,000 women and girls die in causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. And 99% of those are in the world's poorest countries. You read Catholic social teaching, papal documents, you won't find a whisper of those deaths in the church's ethical thinking. So, you know, it used to be that every woman faced the risk of her own death, and every man faced the risk of the death of his wife, his beloved wife, when she was pregnant. I don't know how many of you know the film The Red Violin. It's a very understated film, which is absolutely wonderful, about a man who paints a violin with his wife's blood when she dies in childbirth. And it's the story of what happens to that violin afterwards. So there is a grief around pregnancy and birth. And even if all goes well, you then look at this little squirming worm of humanity and think, oh my God, are you really mine? And what am I going to do with you? And then they get to 45 and you're still, you know, someone said you can only ever be as happy as the happiest of your children. I think that as the unhappiest of your children, I think that puts a terrible burden on children. My happiness should not be totally freighted by my children's unhappiness, because they've got enough to bear if they're unhappy without my sorrow, but it is still true.
I would also say, just in response to the second to last comment from Anna, or whoever is posing as one of our Annas, that this book, Being Born by Alison Stone, is such a fascinating read. And I think it's really trying to kind of grapple responsibly with the kind of existential crises and anxieties that do come out of either being a mother or being born. But I think avoiding a lot of the problems that you were talking about, Tina, of kind of being so weighted towards natality that then you don't consider this kind of other end of human life. And I think she's really interested in talking about how those things come together, specifically with a reading of Adriana Cavarero, Luce Irigaray, and Grace Jansen. And I think it's a really fascinating text to kind of think through those anxieties and the kinds of burdens that come with pregnancy.
Thank you. I think perhaps I'll read the last question, as we are out of time. From Jacob Quick: conscious that Holy Week is around the corner, the days of which are often referred to as the saving events, terminology coined no doubt by male theologians and male priests, do you have a proposal for a non-event based Christian narrative? It's a good way to end, I think.
I could come in here. I don't want to crowd. Well, you know, I was brought up Presbyterian. I've had my atheist phase. I've had all those phases. But after converting to Catholicism, what I love most is that the only event that matters is creation. And everything else goes back in meaning and time to that unimaginable beginning, whatever we mean by that. But it's, you know, we saw that image of St. Anne earlier. There's this, well, Jesus must have had a mother, of course. So we elevate his mother, and then, hold on a minute, who were her parents? And we go back to Anna Joachim, and you get these medieval genealogies of Jesus, which are just wonderful. It's like turning Hello Magazine or the Daily Mail loose on the Holy Family. They just proliferate. And I do think, you know, that the emphasis, for example, that we get often in Reformed theology is on the cross as the event. Interestingly, the birth of Jesus gets less emphasis as the event, but from the process of Jesus being conceived. And, you know, the Annunciation, was that an event? I watched, yesterday was the Feast of the Annunciation. I was on my houseboat in London and I watched a swan chase a goose. They're all nesting at the moment. They're all a bit edgy. And the swan had these great white wings up and the goose was paddling as fast as it could away. And I thought, my God, I bet that's how Mary felt when that bloody angel appeared. No, I've got enough on my plate without this. How long did she take? It wasn't an event. Oh, hello, an angel. Yes, thanks, pregnant. Oh, Joseph. You know, here comes the baby. That's life isn't like that. And what I love about the Catholic tradition is that it embeds all this in a continuing unfinished narrative of particular lives. The main players on the stage during the incarnation, the saints, the sinners, the everybody. Here comes everybody, as G.K. I know James Joyce said about the Catholic Church. So sorry that I went on a bit. But I don't think there is a single event. I think we need to get away from this idea that the cross is the event. Jesus was God from the time he was conceived. Therefore, even if the cross hadn't happened, the incarnation and reconciliation had happened, or he wouldn't have been God. So I think Claire wants to say something.
Yes, go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, is that okay? I don't want to take up too long, but I just think it's a wonderful question, because I think, as Tina said, actually, in each festival that we might celebrate each day, we might actually be thinking about the whole Christian story. And I think this is very common actually in festivals across the world in different religions and traditions as well. It's a moment to reflect on the whole story. And when you think of the words of the Easter Vigil, I can't remember all of them, I'm just trying to look them up, but you know, from Alpha to Omega, from beginning to end, Jesus is everything. There's a sense of a circularity here. And again, in the doxology, when you say at the end, you know, always has been, always will be, this is a sense of continuity and process that also seems to link together the events. But I think that sometimes in our theology, we do focus on the event without realizing, maybe because there's something in this, you know, Western tradition. I don't know if it is just the Western tradition, but that's where I'm schooled, to really focus on the events, and we pick them out maybe too much. But maybe it's great to have festival days, I'm all for it, but in those each individual day, it's about celebrating so much more than just that day.
And actually, funny you say that, because I have just recognized that one of our Anna Cantelmes is Nontando, who I think, Nontando, you're probably in South Africa again now. Nontando is a wonderful African feminist theologian. So I'm aware we've gone a little over time. And if anyone wants to leave, please do. We said we'd finish at 7. But if you've got time to sit around a bit longer and you want to continue the conversation, we can go on for 10 minutes or so, because I really would like Nontando. It just chimes with what Claire just said. Your question, Nontando, speaking from an African context where death is a continuation of life. The dead are referred to as the living dead. Relationships are not severed by death. So, Nontando, do you want to say anything about that? And welcome.
Thank you so much. I've just been enriched by the conversation, and you know, as you know, especially even now in the context of COVID, but just generally, you know, when you think of the African community, it's always referred to as the living dead, the living, and the yet to be born. So that sense of connectedness, you know, that is part of the community. And so in all the events, like the birth of a child, the living dead are remembered through the, you know, the libation, you know, where you pour the beer, and they also enjoy and partake of the celebration. So there's a sense in which death and life, the spirituality embraces death as a part of life. So I think what has been a challenge, I think, in our context, in terms of, and you know, Tina, you're referring to COVID, you know, and not having the rituals has been really not only just somebody is dying alone without the rituals, without the community support, and also the body viewing, where people actually come and say goodbye to the person in the coffin. And also, you know, the day before the burial, we have the coffin in the house, where the whole night liturgy, where the person is celebrated and people bring their stories, and it's as if they are alive in that room. And so all of those rituals have not been happening because of COVID, and there's a lack of closure for many people. And lack of movement, because when we were under level 5, you couldn't travel. So it meant that people's loved ones died without their loved ones coming to mourn. And so there's a sense of disconnection, I think, with death. And so, so the church is thinking about, what about liturgies that will connect people with the loved ones that have passed on, and continue that understanding of the living dead, that life does not cease after death, it continues. And so, so death is not something, like I grew up going to funerals. So it was like something that I grew up knowing that this is the reality of life. To be alive is to be born, and it's to live, to get married, to have children, and to die. So that kind of, and so there's always that continuation. And so you find even the naming of children, you find that you are named after somebody, the living dead. And also the invoking of the living dead. That's why I think Catholicism, resonates so much in the African context with the litany of the saints, because now what's happening is that the litany of the ancestors is also recognized. So I guess coming from that background where death and life are intersecting, where relationality is not severed even through death, there's that, that recognition. And I think the disruption of COVID, as said, is that it didn't allow those essential rituals that bring closure, that bring celebration of the deceased to happen. And I think that has been the wounding that COVID has brought to many, and lack of closure.
Thank you, Nontando. That's, yeah. And lovely to have you with us. Thank you. So, and also, I mean, it's what occurs to me as you say that is, you're breaching some of those boundaries, because we also know that narrative of birth, life, marriage, children, death can be very punitive in cases of infertility, but also all your amazing work around LGBTQI issues in African society, that also disrupts that narrative a bit, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Because if that is the only paradigm and that doesn't recognize like multiple realities, then that becomes a point where there's this disjuncture when it comes to people of different sexualities, or women that don't have children. Like myself, where there's no place for you, but there's almost like no place, but also a place in the extended family. Like the children of my brothers and sisters are like mine, and other children around. But again, that disruption is, it's happening in terms of the way in which society is changing. But I think those fundamentals can be reclaimed in terms of remembering the women ancestors as an empowering force, that the living dead, to invoke their names, invoking, let's say, Wangari Maathai, her story can be invoked. So you can actually invoke strong women to be able to accompany women, who are right now in the struggle against gender-based violence. There's a sense of invoking and knowing that those women and those that have passed on. What was interesting is that during COVID, that not only in South Africa but around the world, the domestic violence just it rose, the figures, and so many women died. And so, as part of the remembering of those women that passed on, there was for 50 days, there was a story of each woman and invoking her. And interestingly, we've just following in the path of Catholic Women Speak. We've just we're in the process of producing a book capturing the stories of women during COVID. And one of the articles that have been contributed is a litany of all the names of the women that were killed by their intimate partner during this time of COVID, as a way of memory, as a way of a reminder of why we are doing the work that we're doing, why we are pushing for equality, why we are challenging patriarchy. It's like what God says to Cain, that the blood of your sister, the blood of your brother continues to speak. You know, that sense that the death, like the deaths of all the people from COVID continues to speak, in the sense that it critiques our society. It causes us to rethink. So there's that continuation of, it almost like feeds the current, whatever struggles that we engage in are fed by the deaths of women in the hands of their intimate partners, or the deaths of LGBTI people in the hands of homophobic communities that have been fed homophobic theologies. So death continues to speak. I'm not sure I'm making sense, but it continues
Absolutely.
to speak. So there's no severing of ties. We do everything now in the name of over 50 women that were killed, to push us to a world in which no woman will need to be killed, no LGBTI person will need to be killed. So death speaks.
Death speaks. That's such a powerful insight, really. Really. And I suppose it also speaks to our loss of rituals of death in the West, even, you know, when there are token Christian rituals. I remember a friend whose English mother-in-law and Irish mother died within a few days of each other. And she said, you know, we went to Ireland, we had a wake, we stayed up all night getting drunk round the coffin. She said, and by the time we buried her, we'd done a lot of our grieving. She said, we came back to my mother-in-law's funeral and, you know, we traipsed into church and all stood very stiff and rigid, and then left the church and went home. And instead of that 2 or 3 day wake, there was just nothing. So those rituals, it is interesting how to ritualize death as a way of bridging the gap that we're talking about. I guess reluctantly, we are now 15 minutes over, and I'm very aware that people join these sessions with other things to do. Well, I really want to thank Anupama for chairing us and being willing to step in as someone with considerable expertise in these things yourself. Thank you so much for coming in to chair it. And thank you, Sarah, more than I can say, for being the catalyst and the inspiration. Catalyst is a one-off, inspiration, ongoing inspiration. And Claire for joining in and having such rich insights as well. And to all of you, I'm just so delighted. We really do have people here from all over the world tonight, you know. Thank you for watching this seminar discussion. Catherine of Siena College offers online courses in theology, gender and social justice, with a particular emphasis on the educational needs of women in the global south. Our tutors and students represent a diverse learning community of cultures and traditions around the world. To find out more, please visit our website at www.roehampton.ac.uk/Catherine of Siena. Thank you again for joining us for this seminar.